You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. Happy New Year, John.
Happy New Year, Jim.
John, how would you describe the past year financially?
It was a time when a lot of things seemed to stop working. For instance, the U.S. stock market is actually flat for the last 13 or 14 months. So stocks didn't go up. And then, of course, bonds didn't go up. And cash yielded next to nothing. So this was a year when it was very, very hard for investors in general to make money. And a lot of that is because we're towards the end of a cycle in which the government started borrowing basically insane amounts of money, 2008, 2009, in order to prevent the financial crash that began with the subprime mortgage industry in the U.S. from turning into a global depression. Well, every major government in the world has borrowed huge amounts of new money, and most of the private sectors of the major economies have leveraged themselves even further. And that got us through 4 or 5 years in which there wasn't a depression, but at a cost of huge, huge increases in debt and leverage across virtually the entire developed world. And so that kind of a strategy inevitably runs out of steam, and 2015 was when it began to run out of steam. You know, you saw most of the major economies of the world either grow barely at all or not at all, you know, depending on how you calculate it. It looks like China's having a hard landing, and Europe is in absolute chaos right now. And in terms of, well, a lot of the energy exporters are really suffering. Like, I understand that Canada is kind of flatland right now. You guys are not really growing anymore because the price of oil is so low, and that's causing massive layoffs in Alberta and elsewhere. And that's reflecting in the housing bubble bursting. So even a previously extremely healthy economy like Canada's or Australia's or Brazil's, for that matter, you know, economies that depend on commodity exports are suffering. So wherever you look, there are big problems now heading into 2016, and there are things that didn't get fixed in 2015 that really should have, that will come back to bite us. So I think this was kind of a wasted year in a lot of ways, a lost year. And 2016 is when these problems have to be dealt with one way or the other. You know, a lot of things are going to come to a head. The junk bond market is getting ready to basically implode because of all the energy-related debt that was taken on during the shale oil and shale gas booms. And China's got a credit bubble that's bursting that it really doesn't know what to do with. It's chasing around a lot of its short sellers and speculators and trying to blame them for the crisis, when really it was the government borrowing way too much money and allowing entities in the private or the quasi-private sector to leverage themselves to the hilt. Now they're blowing up. You know, that's just how markets work. And Europe, of course, is going to have to deal with, first of all, the fallout of the Syrian war. They've got 1 million new refugees from the Middle East to deal with, and probably another million coming in 2016. And they've got the rise of political parties that are either of the right or the left, but in both cases, anti-Euro and anti-austerity. So the Eurozone is probably going to have to dramatically devalue the euro in the year ahead. And that's going to impact everybody else in the world. All the trading partners of the big European countries are going to suffer if the euro plunges. So I think that 2016 will be a mirror image in a lot of ways of 2015, where 2015 was fairly stable, and really not all that much happened, even though there were a lot of headlines. But if you look at the big stock market indices or the bond markets, it looks like a fairly placid year. But in reality, there was a lot going on under the surface. Well, a lot of that stuff is going to come to the surface in 2016. So where 2015 was, all things considered, fairly low volatility when you look at the beginning and the ending numbers for a lot of the world stock markets, next year is going to be the opposite. It's going to be extreme volatility and very noticeable volatility. So we could easily have a huge bull market in U.S. and Canadian stocks as the rest of the world decides, this is where they want to put their money in North America. Or we could have a huge crash as overvaluation and too much leverage finally comes back to bite us. And the junk bond market blows up, and that takes down a lot of hedge funds, which take down a lot of big banks, which cause the general financial markets in the U.S. and potentially Canada to really implode. So either one of those things is possible, and that's part of what makes 2016 such an interesting prospect.
Now, of course, we know when things are going up or down, there's always a way to make money on it. How can a person profit from a very, very volatile 2016?
Well, if you think of 2016 as a replay of 2007, 2008, then just go to the movie The Big Short, and that'll give you some ideas of how to play it. Because basically you want to bet against the things that have worked in the previous 3 or 4 years. And that would mean betting against the large cap technology stocks in the U.S., because they've had such huge runs for such a long time that they're ready to go. Bet against the big banks, because they've recovered and actually look kind of healthy if you assume that all their assets are worth what they say they're worth, which they're not, and so bet against them. I think government bonds are kind of questionable, because right now we're in kind of a deflationary phase of the process where we're really worried about commodities plunging further and taking down all the commodity-based economies, yada yada, and causing negative inflation around the world. And that's actually kind of good for high-grade government bonds. But the responses of the world's governments are what will tell the tale by the end of 2016. I think we're going to see a new wave of experimental monetary policy start to bubble up in the developed world. And, you're seeing the beginnings of it in Finland, of all places, where they're getting ready to implement a guaranteed income for everybody. I think it was 8,000 euros a year, or maybe 800 euros a month. It was a number in that range, where they're just going to print the money and give it to people. And that's a variation of a debt jubilee, which has been talked about for a while, which is now seems to have been renamed QE for the people, in which governments, instead of bailing out the big banks and dumping a bunch of money on bank balance sheets, which the big banks don't do anything with, they're going to start giving money directly to individuals, maybe with the proviso that we have to pay off debt with it, or maybe not, as in the case of Finland, where everybody just gets an guaranteed income. And that seems to be being combined with the idea behind modern monetary theory, which is kind of a new agey economic theory that says that in a world of fiat currencies and unlimited printing presses, governments really don't have to tax their citizens, and they don't have to borrow money in order to finance themselves. All they have to do is print the money and just print as much as they need to do what they need to do and leave the rest of us alone. And that's a very, very seductive idea to a lot of people, because it sounds so clean and simple. But there's one fatal flaw, and it resides in the phrase, do what they need to do. If you let governments decide what it is they need to do, in other words, what their needs are in terms of new money creation, then they'll just go insane. They'll go completely wild, because needs are indistinguishable from wants if you don't have to prioritize. And wants are infinite. If you tell governments, print as much as you need, all of a sudden, every single thing on their constituents' wish list will be a need, and they'll create the money that is required to pay for these things, whatever they are. And we'll see a currency crisis. That'll be the end of the fiat currency world. But I don't think governments quite get that yet, and I think they're going to be desperate enough during 2016 to try this. And so that's why it's going to be a fascinating time. If we actually try that experiment where the debt jubilee idea gets put into place, or the guaranteed income idea happens in more and more countries, then all bets are literally off. And you want to avoid these fiat currencies like the plague, and you want to get into real stuff, because if governments can and intend to create almost infinite amounts of fiat currency, while they can't create infinite amounts of farmland and gold and silver and high quality rental properties and oil wells, then you're going to see the real side of the world turn around and get a lot more valuable in a very short time. So I think that by the end of 2016, we'll be seeing something like that happen as more and more governments panic because they're finding out that the QE that they did over the last 5 or 6 years didn't work. You know, they doubled their debt, they massively increased their money supply, and their economy is still shrinking. They're in danger of dropping down into a recession, which would be existentially threatening for a lot of the current systems out there, at least in terms of politics. You know, you'd see National Front win in France if France drops back into a recession under the current circumstances with the immigration being what it is. And you would see Podemos win in Spain. You know, that's a right-wing party in France and a left-wing party in Spain with a lot of the same goals, which is basically do away with austerity, get rid of the restrictions imposed on them by the euro. And so you would see monetary chaos in Europe that would spread to the rest of the world. And so that's what we're looking at, Jim. 2016 is going to be a year in which this stuff either becomes conceivable in the mainstream or is actually put into practice. So it all depends on the timing now. If we really go for it and we're doing this stuff by the end of the year, then 2016 will be just this historically fascinating and crazy year. Or it'll be 2017 if we just lay the groundwork next year and then really go for it then. But one way or another, this stuff is coming.
We'll have more with John Rubino right after the break.
Unbelievable harmonies, spectacular performance, the ultimate tribute to the Everly Brothers and Simon and Garfunkel. Bird Dog and the Vintage Electric Band, Saturday, January 9th at the Alex Goulden Hall. Buy online and save at ontourtickets.com. More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on The Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Rubino. John, if we go into money printing craziness, does it mean the world will be like Zimbabwe, where they have trillion-dollar bills that are worth about 10 cents?
Well, you would think that the markets would conclude that if governments are going to increase their money creation by orders of magnitude because they can, that people would lose faith in those currencies. And so you would see them start to fall like dominoes. I would think that whoever's doing it in the most extreme way would become targets of short sellers and would basically lose the faith of the financial markets. And so you'd see currencies start to really plunge. And that would put pressure on the remaining strong currencies because you can't export to weak currency countries if you've got a strong currency. And, you know, the U.S. is seeing that now. We're seeing the early stages of this process where our multinationals are reporting worse and worse earnings. Corporate earnings are falling in the U.S. And a lot of that is being blamed on the strong dollar. Well, let the euro be devalued dramatically next year and the yen and possibly the yuan, and that just exacerbates the problem that U.S. corporations now have. And they're already shrinking. They're already seeing lower earnings year over year. So another year like that, and the U.S. will have no choice but to join in. And so then you've got a real race to the bottom. You know, you've got Jim Rickards' currency war in full force out there. And so almost however you slice it, we're heading for some kind of a currency crisis in which people begin to lose faith in some or many or most of the world's big fiat currencies. And we can see the policies that will bring this about start to coalesce right now. If you look at what's being done, you know, at the periphery, in the Eurozone periphery where the new parties are coming along that don't want any part of austerity, and someplace like Finland where they're instituting national guaranteed income, and Switzerland is actually considering the same thing, and you know, Brazil's currency has plunged, so you're seeing it all over the place. And even you know, Canada in effect has devalued its currency dramatically in the last few years. So we're seeing stuff like this happen all over the world. And the question then becomes, when do the markets figure out that a lot of this stuff is explicit public policy. That it's the government's goal and objective to diminish the value of their currency, not just one time, but on an ongoing basis. That from now on, we're going to make our currency worth less and less year after year after year, as far as the eye could see. And, once people figure that out, once people see that it's happening, and it's not just it's not just Argentina, that it's 5 or 6 major countries, and that the other major countries are looking for ways to respond to it, and probably will have to devalue their own currencies, and then it just snowballs. So that's how I view the next year or two. We're going to reach a point where governments see no choice but to devalue, and the markets figure this out and respond accordingly. And that's a totally different situation from what we've seen in the last few years, because you won't have stable to gradually increasing asset prices in that kind of a situation. You'll have some assets just going through the roof and other assets collapsing. And it's going to be very hard to figure out if you don't understand the underlying dynamic. So we'll see the financial markets adjust to this and figure it out eventually. And then, then it'll be a very different world, because the major fiat currencies won't work as well as they used to. They won't have the respect of the markets, and the governments won't have the ability to just create as many new pieces of currencies they want to and have those things be accepted in the market the way they've been in the past. So really, it's the exchange rate mechanism that is the fatal flaw of the whole debt jubilee, modern monetary theory framework that's going to be put in place pretty soon here, because those things only work if everybody continues to accept these currencies at their stated value. And when people don't do that anymore, then the whole thing falls apart. So, fascinating time to be watching this stuff, and more necessary than ever to protect yourself against the volatility that'll flow from it.
Could this see the creation of a world currency where there's just one flat world credit? That's all we use.
Yeah, well, it's possible that we fall back on the IMF's special drawing rights, which is basically a basket of currencies. So it's sort of like an ETF of currencies, where we would use that as a medium of exchange and a way of storing wealth. But all it is a basket of currencies that are being rapidly destroyed by their governments. So I don't think the IMF's special drawing rights, the SDR, I don't think that would be a long-lived currency alternative. We might try it for a while, but unless it comes with some kind of supranational restriction on national money printing, I don't know what good it would do us. So I think that eventually, and this is also, as I mentioned Jim Rickards before, this is another of his ideas, that eventually everybody's going to figure out that there's only one thing we can all devalue against, and that's gold. So they'll go back to some kind of a modified gold standard in which national currencies are convertible into gold, and that imposes the discipline on national governments that they haven't had since 1971, and forces them to limit their money creation, and thereby forces the system to control its credit accumulation. You can't leverage yourself to the hilt as easily in a world where the money supply is only growing at 2% a year. But I kind of think we have to go through some kind of a big crisis before everybody accepts that that's their only alternative.
Would this be one of the reasons why China has been stocking up on every piece of gold they can lay their hands on over the past 5 years?
Yeah, that's one explanation for it. China seems to get it. They see the trends out there, and they have a historical affinity for gold. Culturally, they respect gold as a store of value in a way that we don't in the West. So basically, the world's gold miners have been producing 2,700 tons of gold a year, and China and Russia and India between them have been buying it all, and then some. So in addition to what the world's gold mines are producing, the Western world, the developed world, central banks have been shipping some of their gold to China to make up the difference. And so we're seeing this huge movement of gold from west to east, and it doesn't seem to be letting up. China is still buying a lot, Russia's still buying a lot, even with their current financial crises. So it does look like they have faith in gold going forward as a store of value. And it's not clear whether they intend to someday explicitly back their currencies with gold in the sense of, going on to a gold standard, or just accumulate this gold as a way of giving legitimacy to their currencies. Something that they've got on their books that in a currency crisis can be sold for a lot of money. And so that makes their currency more attractive for people who might want to use it as a savings vehicle, as a reserve asset. And that's a reasonable strategy. If that's all it is, if they're just buying something that they think will hold its value over the next 100 years, they're probably right. And they know they're right because they have a better sense of history than most of the West does.
Could we see governments in the West seize private gold to up their reserves? I mean, it happened in the 30s in the U.S.
Yep, the U.S. did it. And it's completely conceivable that we have all kinds of capital controls when things really spin out of control. And some of those capital controls could apply to gold and maybe silver. Who knows? They could decide they want to confiscate gold. And it seems less likely now than back in the 1930s, because back then gold was the money that people used. They carried it around and spent it. And now that's not the case. So hopefully we won't reach the point where governments turn owning gold into a crime like they did back in the 1930s. But you really never know. And the way you respond to that uncertainty is to diversify geographically. If you can move some money overseas, like store some gold in a Swiss bank vault or a Hong Kong bank vault, or buy shares in foreign gold miners that aren't necessarily subject to IRS confiscation. That's one way to diversify. It doesn't guarantee that things are better in the country where you put your other assets, because you never know which country is going to blow up first, or who's going to get craziest fastest. But it does make sense to move some money around as best you can in a world where so many governments are pursuing such absolutely crazy policies. If we're going to do things that are almost guaranteed based on financial history to cause a crisis, a really big crisis, which in the past has been followed by more authoritarian, more controlling governments, then you definitely want to move your money around. You can't know where the best place to put it is, but if you have some capital in 5 or 6 different places, then there's a better chance that some of it is going to survive whatever comes.
And would we see more government efforts to ban cash, where in Europe, for example, you can only withdraw something like 750 euros from your bank account in cash?
Well, yeah, lots of countries are trying to go cashless. And you're seeing it in Europe. And, the U.S. isn't too far from that either. We don't like the idea of cash. Our government doesn't. And so it's going to get less and less attractive and more inconvenient to use cash based on government policy. First of all, zero interest rates or negative interest rates are very much anti-bank account. You don't want to hold money in a bank if it's going to charge you rather than pay you interest. And so that leads, in theory, people to pull their money out, put it under the mattress or wherever. And so look at Scandinavia and look at France and look at Australia for anti-cash public policy ideas being put into practice. And you'll see that if these things work, if there isn't a public outcry and people just accept it and it allows them to push interest rates down into negative territory, that other governments will adopt those policies. And yeah, it's another thing that 2016 will probably bring is the real explicit war on cash, when a lot of countries will just decide that in order to pursue the policies that they want to pursue, they've got to make cash so unattractive that people don't demand to use a lot of it and don't see it as a good alternative to a bank account yielding a negative interest rate. So, I think there are philosophical questions that go beyond economic policy here, and one is that cash is really our last bastion of financial privacy. You and I can go out and buy something from someone using $20 bills, and nobody's paying attention to that. Nobody can track it. But if we buy it with our credit card or our cell phone or a check, then there's a paper trail or an electronic trail. And so the government can basically, they can track your position right now via your cell phone, your movements. and soon they'll be able to track all your financial transactions and combine the two, and they've got a perfect picture of what you're doing 24/7. So our privacy ceases to exist, and then we're dependent on our government to be good and to be nice to us. And if the guys in charge decide they want to mess with us in one way or another, to stop us from speaking out against their policies or stop us from supporting other politicians that they disagree with, and whatever, that gives them a lot of leverage. When they know everything about your finances, they can access your bank account online if they want to, or your brokerage account, and can use anything that you don't want to be made public against you. That gives governments a huge amount of leverage. And so that means we just kind of, then we're waiting for the next crazy or desperate or evil person to gain power, and then it's over. Then it's 1984, or, name your dystopian novel. That's where we are. And so it's a very scary prospect, and the war on cash is a part of that process.
I remember once I got a pay raise and my boss said, I apologize for what it comes out to, and it was 1984. And I said, so I expect you to raid my bedroom in the middle of the night swinging off a helicopter.
Yeah, you were ahead of your time there.
Oh, dear. Well, I hope we don't become 1984. Although,
me too.
The mid-'80s were fun. They weren't the disaster that Orwell predicted, but perhaps he was just a few years too early.
Yeah. It looks like he's ahead of his time.
As usual.
Yeah. So a lot of the technologies that he had in 1984 are starting to be developed. You probably saw the new social metric they're developing in China, where they track basically all your purchases, all your web surfing, et cetera, and they come up with a social score of how good a citizen you are.
Oh boy, we're all in trouble then.
Yeah, really.
You'd be in trouble probably just for listening to this show.
Oh yeah. The stuff we're talking about today would be frowned upon.
Well, I hear they are cracking down on government officials who criticize the government now. And as you said, the Chinese are going after short-term lenders. They said it's not illegal to short sell, but if you're not, quote, responsible, we'll come for you. And as you said, it all goes back to government policy, and people were just following it.
Yeah.
But I guess, we also know, though, today's hero is tomorrow's zero. Mm-hmm. Well, it will be interesting, and I guess that's why we do shows like this. So it's been a flat 2016, and as the Chinese curse says, may you live in interesting times in the new year.
Yep, they will be very interesting, Jim.
John, have a great new year.
Thanks, you too.
My guest has been John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. You're listening to HowStreet.com Radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. Happy New Year's, everybody. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com Radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com Radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.